Hello and welcome everyone to our event, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict during the times of coronavirus. The webinar today is brought to us by the Leon Charney Resolution Center, founded by Ms. Tzili Charney 5 years ago, who envisioned creating a better today and tomorrow by founding a safe space dedicated to conducting civil discourse using diplomatic skills in the spirit of Mr. Leon Charney, who played an important role as an unofficial advisor to President Carter as part of his behind-the-scenes role in the Camp David Accords. Events like this one today serve as an integral part of the center's mission. We encourage open discussion about diverse opinions amidst our ongoing efforts to resolve the conflict. And my name is Beniamin. I come from Poland, and I'll be your host for today. I was born and raised in Poland, and in 2016, I moved abroad to study at the Eastern Mediterranean International School. During the 2 years at EMIS, I got to learn about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, interact with people who live this conflict every day, and take part in projects like the Yakopas Conference organized by EMIS and the Peace Conference simulation organized by the Charney Center. These events opened my eyes to different perspectives and possible solutions, but my main takeaway was that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a lot more complex and dynamic than I could have imagined. I graduated from EMIS in 2018, and currently I study at New York University, Abu Dhabi, but I keep those learning in mind. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Peter Jones, Associate Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Previously, he held various positions related to international affairs and security at the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Privy Council Office, and the Department of Defense. He's an expert on security in the Middle East and Track 2 diplomacy, and he led the Middle East Security and Arms Control Project at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in Sweden in 1990s. He is presently leading several Track 2 initiatives in South Asia and the Middle East. Moreover, with us today, there will be 4 EMIS graduates and Charney Center ambassadors. So first, we will go with a round of introductions.
Sure. So my name is Clemens. I was born in Germany, raised in Spain, and I graduated from EMIS 1 year ago, as Benj already mentioned. And now I study at the University of Bayreuth in Germany, philosophy and economics.
Hello, my name is Nicolay. I was born and raised in Russia, and I graduated from EMIS the same year as Clemens, the last year. I had an honor to organize a peace simulation in EMIS in 2019, and I'm really glad to attend this webinar.
Hello, my name is Shana Hazboun. I am also a classmate of both Clemens and Nicolay. I've graduated in EMIS in 2019. I'm currently doing my gap year, in which I volunteered at the Eastern Mediterranean International School and interning at the Leon Charney Resolution Center.
Hi everyone, my name is Ophyr Hanan. I'm Israeli and American and was part of the inaugural graduating class of the Eastern Mediterranean International School, class of 2016. And I have been working at the Leon Charney Resolution Center for the past 2 years now as the coordinator of the ambassador program. And it's great to be here.
Thanks. It's great to have all of you here. And now we will ask Peter to give us his opening remarks on the topic of conflict in the times of coronavirus.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to the Leon Charney Center. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. I thought that what I would do today, it's a very big topic. So I thought what I would do is, first of all, make some comments about where I see the Israeli-Palestinian process of right now, what's happening, what I think could happen, how I think Corona might influence it, and then step back for a few minutes at the end and say a few words about the Middle East generally, the regional situation, and again, how I think that Corona might influence it for good or for bad. So to begin with, we know from empirical research and from experience, there have been many experiences where major crises or catastrophic events have caused a seemingly intractable conflict to shift course towards resolution. We know in the academic world, we talk about ripeness and ripeness theory, the idea that certain conflicts are ripe to be resolved at certain moments in time. And one of the fundamental aspects of this idea of ripeness is that a crisis, an impending crisis, a crisis that's underway, causes a shift in thinking, causes people to reassess the course of the conflict, and causes people to reassess the pros and the cons of changing course. So we know that that happens, and we know that it has happened in the past, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes crises sort of solidify people in their points of view, and they cause people to become more entrenched. So one of the factors that seems to be the case historically is that if a crisis is to cause a shift in positions and a shift towards the resolution of an intractable conflict, someone has to step forward to lead. And hopefully someone on both sides, but at least someone on one of the sides has to step forward to lead. And so in that case, right now at least, that doesn't seem to be happening in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think there was some hope on some quarters that a change in government in Israel as a result of the multiple elections might bring that about, but that doesn't seem to have happened for now. And I know that many people I know in the Israeli peace camp think that the decision made by Gantz to join the coalition was a major mistake. I'm not so sure about that. Maybe it wasn't. Time will tell. So that's sort of the broader background. I think now moving on to the question of the moment, which of course is annexation. It appears to be moving forward. The coalition deal gives Netanyahu the maximum flexibility to pursue this if he wishes to do that. And that's a point that's been noted by several people who studied the agreement that formed the coalition government, that in virtually all areas, it's a partnership that Gantz and Netanyahu have to agree. But on this question of annexation, Netanyahu has a relatively free hand to go forward if he can create the political circumstances to do so. However, I think that it's not necessarily a done deal. And I think that there are sort of internal Israeli political calculations that are going to be very sensitive to the prospects for real and for even imagined international pushback and even pushback within Israel itself. I think that really we're talking about four things here. First of all, the question of whether Trump will be reelected and what impact that's going to have on the peace process going forward. Secondly, the serious of purpose of the European Union around this issue. Thirdly, regional pushback, the pushback of countries in the region. And fourthly, the Palestinians, how they will react. And then, of course, on top of all that, there's Israeli public opinion and how that'll be impacted by these four things. So just quickly, I want to look at these four things. First of all, the US. It's very hard right now. I mean, everything's in great flux in the United States right now. I live right next door to them, and every day it seems to be changing quite dramatically. But the question really is US acceptance of annexation going to go forward or going to continue, or is it going to weaken? It's clear, as I understand it, that the sort of foreign policy elite, which looks at the Middle East, the security services, the military, they don't like annexation. They see it as being a significant problem and one which is going to really worsen the situation in the region. The right wing, the evangelical movement, of course, does like annexation very much. But the question is, will Trump win the election in November? If he does not win, their power to push this thing forward is diminished quite greatly. However, it's difficult to say with certainty that Joe Biden would himself be opposed. He sort of expresses regret about it. He talks about it as not being something that would be helpful. But there's a bit of a history of sort of expressing regret at what gets done and then sort of accepting it and moving on. So it's not entirely clear to me that even if he were elected, Biden would stop it unless other forces came along to really push for it to be stopped. So I think the bottom line here is that as he looks at the US sort of political picture, Bibi Netanyahu thinks that this is something he can navigate. It will take skill and it will take luck, but he can probably navigate through it to get an annexation accepted by at least a large portion of the American political elite. And particularly if it's not as bad, quote unquote, bad an annexation as some people are mooting. If he comes out with an annexation plan, which is less dramatic, I would call the US a kind of a wash in terms of its impact on annexation. There are some good points and some bad points. The EU is rather interesting. I mean, the EU, America is Israel's great benefactor in many ways, but Israel's greatest trading partner is Europe. And so the EU, if it is prepared to really stand up, and Germany and France are the keys to that, can in fact make a difference. But the question is the EU ready to do that? And the evidence is mixed at this point. Obviously, the EU, not as unified a body as it appears to be often. I think this is the one that probably gives Netanyahu some pause and some uncertainty. And then there's the regional situation. Jordan has obviously come out very strongly against annexation, and it's obvious why. I mean, it would have a very serious impact on the stability of the Hashemite kingdom. Other regional countries, and particularly the Arab countries with whom Israel has worked very hard to forge a relationship, even though it's not a declared official relationship. There's been a lot of progress over the last couple of years in terms of informal contacts between Israel and many countries, particularly the Gulf Arab countries. Most of those countries have expressed great misgivings at annexation. They've said that it would have an impact on their ability to talk to Israel. I wonder how true that is. I think in many of those countries, there's a desire for other reasons, primarily because they fear Iran and they see Israel as a potential partner in tackling Iran, that they probably would want to have relations with Israel anyway. So there'll be a lot of public misgivings expressed about annexation if Israel goes ahead and does it. But I think many of those Gulf Arab countries will continue to have clandestine relations with Israel, and that really might be all that Israel wants, or all that Netanyahu wants. So again, on that one, Netanyahu probably thinks this is something he can navigate with skill and care and luck. And finally, there's the question of the Palestinians. I mean, I think the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is seen largely as a spent force. Its ability to really influence Israel is seen as being quite diminished. However, the loss of security cooperation would be serious. And I think that the Israeli security establishment, the Mossad, the military, the Shin Bet, they are all warning, as far as we know from public statements anyways, they are warning the Netanyahu government not to go ahead with annexation, because it would be a serious problem for them if they lost security cooperation. I think more broadly, if the Palestinian Authority really does fold up, as has been threatened, simply sort of Oslo's not working, we're folding up, and Israel has to essentially reoccupy the entirety of the West Bank and govern it, that would be a disaster. I'm not sure how serious a threat that is, although one hears it from some Palestinian commentators. I think there are many Palestinian elites who benefit from the current situation, and they'll be reluctant to fold the Palestinian Authority up. But the PA's ability to govern the territories it does have control over, or nominal control over, is weakening and will be further weakened. And there's an economic dimension to that as the coronavirus bites. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I think, again, Netanyahu probably thinks he can navigate the Palestinian aspect of this, and that an escalation in violence on the part of those who are dramatically opposed to annexation would really be to his advantage politically, as long as it doesn't become too much of an escalation, which really embroils Israel in a conflict that would be difficult for it to prosecute successfully. So again, as you look at all these four factors, the pros and the cons, I think for at least three of them, Netanyahu thinks, given luck and skill and care, he can probably navigate them in a way that will get him to his destination. It's really the EU one that I think he's not sure about. And I think that's a rather interesting point. So right now, despite a lot of talk, I'm not sure that Bibi Netanyahu does feel that the consequences of annexation would necessarily be all that dire. I think he feels he can probably get away with it. This could change, of course, and as I say, we know that the Israeli security professionals, at least from the public statements we hear, we know that they're opposed to it. They will try to slow progress. There's a phrase we use in government, slow walking. When you're a bureaucrat and you have orders to do something, you pick up the file and you walk very slowly with it to try to prevent it from going very far, very fast. And so I think, one can see that happening to some extent. I think in this context, the coalition agreement which Gantz signed with Netanyahu is rather interesting. And I for a long time pondered this question of why he signed an agreement which seems to give Netanyahu an absolutely free hand on annexation, whereas everything else has to be done jointly and in cooperation and collaboration. It struck me as rather interesting. And this is just my own speculation. I wonder if it's not a question of giving Netanyahu enough rope to hang himself. I mean, annexation is Netanyahu's project. He wants it to happen. He wants it. He's committed himself to his political base that it should happen. And I think Gantz, he looked at the situation after a year of inconclusive elections and no real prospect of there being a conclusive election, which would get him power, and realized that going into a coalition government, but a coalition where the main issue of the next few months will be one for which Netanyahu is entirely responsible, and one which may not succeed, could be his path to actually breaking the political deadlock. Again, this is pure speculation on my part, but it's the only sort of sensible explanation I can see as to why Gantz did what he did. And it'll be interesting to watch it play out. Because if it's true, if that sort of speculation that I have as to why Gantz did it is true, then what it means is really there's a saboteur within the government. and it's Gantz and his coalition who will try and stop annexation or make it go as badly as possible, and then reap the benefit of Netanyahu failing to deliver on his signature promise. We'll see. And this is where public opinion comes in, I think, most dramatically and most strongly in Israel. We know that aside from the key right-wing constituencies that Netanyahu courts, the idea of annexation is, it's not popular, it's not unpopular, people are just waiting to see what happens, and they're not necessarily terribly committed to it if it goes badly. And so if annexation could be made to go badly and be made to be problematic, if the costs rise and are dramatic both in Israel and in Palestine and internationally, public opinion could go against it very strongly. That's the impression I have. I'll be very interested, obviously, those who live in Israel will probably have a very different take on it. I haven't been able to visit since the coronavirus. I was there early in the year before Corona started, so I'm looking forward to hearing that. So that's my sort of general sense quickly of the political situation in Israel, and a few comments now on sort of coronavirus. Obviously, it's been devastating economically, both in Israel and Palestine and more generally across the region. I mean, if you look at some of the reports that have come out from various organizations, they're really rather frightening. There was a report a few weeks ago from the OECD, which says that, although the Middle East has not fared so badly in terms of deaths from corona, with a few exceptions, Iran, of course, being one of them, the economic costs have been dramatic, and they're going to get worse, especially for the countries that are most vulnerable. The UN predicts that about 9 million people in the region, a further 9 million who are not already living in poverty, will fall into it in the next few months as a result of coronavirus. And these are people who had just, in countries like Egypt and so on, begun to work themselves out of poverty, and they'll fall back. And we again know from sort of social science and history and research that very often a population of people who were beginning to see some hope and who were beginning to move forward in their lives and who then suddenly fall back, they are the real fodder for revolution and for political discord, because they've had a dream snatched away from them. And of course, that's one of the great dangers of the coronavirus. Bottoming oil prices are affecting the leeway for oil producing countries in terms of their ability to sustain the deal they have with their populations, which is to say a relatively autocratic form of government in return for cradle to grave care. That's going to be much more difficult as time goes by for these governments to sustain, and that has obvious implications or potential implications. I wouldn't say it's going to happen anytime very soon. I think these governments are more resilient than many give them credit for, but it is a gradual erosion and weakening of their ability to sustain this social contract that they've had with their people during the oil era. So the pandemic is causing a very sort of a massive set of economic turmoils and upheavals across the region. GDP growth is going to be affected in 2020. MENA, Middle East and North African economies, there will be a contraction in 2020. Growth in the region might fall to something like negative 4.2%, which is a significant drop in growth, particularly in countries that are most vulnerable across the region. And so things like remittances and tourism, which are non-producing countries, are one of the major things the non-producing countries have for their economic stability, has fallen off and will continue to fall off for the foreseeable future. In looking at the next few months, the IMF said if everything goes right, and if there's no second wave, and if a vaccine is found, and if everything goes right, then they're predicting what they call a V-shaped recovery. So it goes down quickly and it goes up quickly. So within a short space of time, growth could resume. But of course, that requires everything to go right. And as social restrictions are lifted, and as people get tired of living this way, there are fears of a resurgence of the virus in different places. There's a sense that a vaccine may not come within the next year. All of these things will cause that optimistic prediction of a V-shaped recovery to be derailed, and for the crisis to go on. So I think it's too soon to say what the impact of all this will be on the region economically and politically, but I think a lot of things have to go right for the region to get out of this with only the damage that has been suffered to this point, and that's pretty significant. But I mean, there might be a bright side, and that is that, the crisis could offer an opportunity for regional cooperation and collaboration to be further investigated. There have been calls over the years for some sort of Middle Eastern regional collaboration cooperative system, such as we see in different parts of the world, in Asia with ASEAN and Europe with the OSCE. And it's never happened in the Middle East. And the variety of reasons for that. And so people have been thinking about it and studying it and calling for it. And we've seen in the last few months a resurgence in people talking about this in the region and outside it. Some sort of a collaborative mechanism to help countries address these crises and shocks together, to cooperate on economic matters, to cooperate on public health matters. We are beginning to hear rumors and comments that countries like Israel and some of the Arab countries are in fact collaborating on public health issues, much more so than is publicly admitted. And so that is a potentially positive sign that may go forward. And more generally, the idea of some kind of regional framework for collaboration on things like pandemics and more broadly on climate issues and so on, it might be given a push. Now, these things don't happen quickly. It won't happen overnight. But if this crisis, if Corona does create the pressure for real sustained effort to create a Middle Eastern regional cooperation system, that would be a positive outcome of all this. And Israel has much to offer the region in all of these areas. I mean, I don't go back to the days of Oslo when people like Shimon Peres were writing books about the new Middle East and talking about Israel at the hub of a regional cooperation system. I don't think that's likely, but I think slowly and by piecemeal and in certain functional areas, if Israel can integrate itself into the region overtly, which will require a resolution of the Palestinian issue, I think, then there is a real prospect for this crisis to have left us with a sort of a positive outcome. But much will depend on the next few months, will depend on how the annexation goes, will depend on how the American election goes. And so I leave my comments here with a kind of a, things are looking bad, but they might get better, but we'll have to get lucky. I think that's the way I'd leave it. Thank you.
Thank you for this introduction, very rich in content, starting with conceptual framework, then moving to tackling the big elephant in the room, which is the current deal on annexation, and outlining the different aspects that are stopping or pushing it forward. And also then speaking of Corona crisis in both Israeli, Palestinian, and the more general Middle Eastern context. It's quite scary to hear that 9 more million people can be pushed into poverty. So let's hope that the recovery will be swift, but also that it will be green and sustainable. So now let's take interventions and questions to our experts from graduate who also have lived or are still living this conflict and certainly have their own perspective on this topic. So maybe let's start with Shana.
My question is about the dialogue. More specifically, what are your thoughts on how the Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy and dialogue, both officially and non-officially, how do you think they will re-emerge after this period?
That's a very good question. Before I answer, let me just go back. When I talk about that 9 million, I should have been more clear that it's in addition to those in Syria and Yemen and areas of active conflict. Obviously, tens of millions are falling into poverty because that's just generally in the regions which aren't affected by conflict. That's what the IMF statistic is. But sorry, now to go to your question. I mean, I'm running right now some Israeli-Palestinian dialogues. I've been running them for many years. Obviously, we can't meet. We can't get together and have the conversations. We're doing a little bit by this sort of mechanism, but it's not as rich and fruitful as the idea of meeting and talking. At the track 2 or track 1.5 level, it's not entirely, but largely been stopped at a critical time when it's most needed. My sense is that at the track 1 level, there's very little official dialogue going on. There is probably dialogue going on and discussion at the level of sort of trying to coordinate security. There has been for a while. We know that it's gone on even when times have been bad. But I mean, if we believe the statements that have been made by the head of the Palestinian Authority, even there, the Palestinians say that they're about to pull back from that. We'll see. In terms of the reemergence from Corona, I think so much is going to depend on how annexation goes. And in a sense, annexation is happening, if it happens at all, during a time of Corona. And therefore, the ability of people to gather and talk and oppose it as they might do otherwise, to have large mass demonstrations, to have gatherings of small groups to talk about it, is constrained. And this may be something that Netanyahu feels is to his benefit. I'm not sure that's the case. I think that annexation will succeed or fail depending on those factors that I mentioned during the course of my comments. And I think dialogue would help, but I think those factors will go forward regardless. I think, though, that there's an enormous opportunity if people are ready for the time when it is possible for dialogue to resume in terms of some of these ideas of regional cooperation, regional collaboration, both pan-regionally, but also between Israel and Palestine and their immediate neighbors. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen, and people who study the region have known this for a long time, but Corona has made it very clear, is that you can't really talk about Israel and Palestine and Jordan, and even to some extent Egypt and Lebanon as entirely separate entities. People travel, people move, people go across boundaries. Viruses go with them. You have to think of these areas in these sorts of cases as sort of contiguous wholes, and therefore a kind of a simply an Israeli strategy for fighting Corona, or a Palestinian or a Jordanian. You have to have a strategy amongst those countries where they collaborate together. It's the only way. And so perhaps one of the areas where we might see dialogue re-emerging when it's possible, and really sort of productive dialogue emerging if the political circumstances are right, is on preparations for the next pandemic or the next big natural disaster. What are the things that the health ministries and the emergency ministries in those countries, what do they have to do together? How do they have to work together? How do they have to track and trace these things together in order to be most effective? So that could be an area where dialogue could resume very quickly and very productively.
Thank you so much for your question, Shana, and thank you, Peter. Yeah, we know that many international intergovernmental events are being pushed ahead because of coronavirus, but it can just happen because of new problems that are emerging and old problems that are still there to be solved. So yeah, let's watch out what's going to happen in this space. And thank you for providing your thought. Next intervention and a question from Ophyr.
Thank you. So we were talking about dialogue and how, in your opinion, Peter, both sides need to merge together and to start discussing things together as a joint unit, as a joint entity. And so my question is, do you think the COVID-19 experience will alter the way the region, states, and people interact more than just dialogue? Do you think there will be some sort of change in the region after this pandemic? I mean, as you said, it showed no boundaries of borders or religion or anything like that. So do you think it will change the way we interact?
That's a very good question. Officially, at least, there's been very little interaction between people from Israel and many of the Arab countries. If you think of the Gulf Arab countries, there's sort of a few people go and so on, but relatively little. So, I mean, I think that if we are moving towards, perhaps as a result of COVID or as a sort of a factor that COVID helped push along, the idea of some sort of regional collaborative framework. And we're looking, I think it would probably, if it begins at all, it will begin by trying to find a few functional areas where it makes sense for the region, the governments and the peoples of the region to begin cooperating. And pandemic preparedness is obviously one, public health is one. To some extent, economic resiliency might be another. That you might see an increased willingness, provided the Israeli-Palestinian situation is not overtly worse, an increased willingness for some of these discussions that we know have happened very quietly. We know that Israeli delegations have gone to the Emirates to talk with sort of leading people there. It's sort of, you get oblique references to it in the public, and occasionally a minister of the Saudi government or the Emirates government will mention that, oh, Israelis were here last week talking about this or that. I mean, that may become more overt. And people may say, look, we've got to put aside some of these differences and begin to really think about the question of how, as a region, we prepare and sort of build off our strengths. And this really gets to the question of normalization. For as long as I've been working on the peace process, which is, since the early 90s, in one capacity, either as an official or as a Track 2 person, the great fear that's been expressed on the Arab side is that we can't normalize relations with Israel too much until there's a Palestinian agreement, until there's a Palestinian state. Because if we normalize relations with Israel before that, that's a reward for Israel, and the Palestinians get nothing. I think that dialogue around what normalization means may begin to change. And people will say, look, it's not a reward that we give Israel. It's something that we need to do, not just with Israel, but across the region as a whole, to normalize on at least a few key areas where it's in all of our interest to begin to work together and think together about how we can tackle some of these issues. But again, I think it's going to rely on there not having been a dramatic worsening, at least, of the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. I think if that happens, key Arab governments, no matter how much they may regard it as being in their interests to talk to Israel about some of these things, they will have difficulty with their own publics in doing so. So this dialogue that has been going on quietly behind the scenes, it may continue to go on, but it won't. I mean, we could take advantage of the corona situation for it to really burst forth and become a much more overt dialogue. And I think that may have difficulty happening if annexation goes forward.
Thank you, Peter, for providing some thoughts and clarity on this. Certainly a very timely topic, as about 2 weeks ago, there was a first airplane with humanitarian support going from Abu Dhabi, landing in Tel Aviv, just to be turned away because Palestinians didn't want to accept that support because it was considered normalization. And next question we could take from Clemens.
Thank you. So as you mentioned in your opening dialogue, the IMF predicts the world economic to shrink by 5%. And from the peace simulations I've attended, I know that building economic perspectives between Israel and Palestine is a key part of building peace. So how do you think that this economic tensions, recession will affect tension or relations between Israel and Palestine?
Well, again, a lot depends on where annexation goes and where the peace process goes. I mean, I think if the worst case doesn't happen and the sort of the peace process kind of lurches along where it is now, or perhaps even, and this is unlikely, but there's some improvement, then I think that, you know, the fact that both countries are suffering economically, or both areas are suffering, they will see that as being, well, we're all in this together, and the whole world is sort of having economic retrenchment, and we'll work through it. And perhaps some of the areas for collaboration that will be opened up by an improvement in the peace process may be helpful there. I think that's a very hopeful analysis. I'm not sure how likely it is to happen. If the situation worsens and annexation in some form goes forward, and don't forget, there are many different kinds of annexation, and there are some forms of annexation which even Gantz and his party would get behind, in fact. So annexation is a range of possibilities, but nevertheless, if something like that goes forward, I see there being a kind of a continuing attempt to separate Israel from Palestine economically on both sides. And the consequences of that will be much more devastating for the Palestinians than for the Israelis, although for the Israelis it will hurt. I mean, a lot of the labor that takes place in Israel is provided by Palestinians, and so that will have an impact. But I think it'll be much more devastating for the Palestinians, but I think that will just be in the context of an overall situation where the Palestinian Authority is in decline, and the ability to sort of manage the Palestinian economy becomes worse and worse. There are some signs that countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar would try to step up and provide more funding for the PA. But again, as their oil revenues decline, as their economic situation declines, as their ability to sustain their own models declines over time, their ability to do that will weaken. And so the territory will be left really for those who have always preached the idea that, you know, peace is impossible and cooperation is impossible, to sort of point to a more steadily worsening situation for most Palestinians and say, well, you see, we told you, it's all been a pipe dream, it's never going to work. And then the other element of that is, as I said in my remarks, if the EU is able to step up in the case of annexation and actually begin to really seriously put in place economic boycotts of Israel, I think that's unlikely, but it's not impossible. And again, I think Germany and France working together would be the key to that happening. If they are willing to do that and able to do that, it would have a very devastating impact on Israel, but also on the Palestinians, because obviously they rely on Israel for much of their economic prosperity. So we can see some very grim potentials. I wouldn't say anything in the world looks terribly hopeful right now. I think everybody's going to suffer, is suffering, and is going to suffer as a result of COVID. It's a question of degrees of suffering and the extent to which people can come together to mitigate the worst impacts of it. But that requires that the peace process go forward and that annexation not go forward. And that's something that, I mean, to some extent, the logic of it, at least in terms of Netanyahu's political base, is not economic. You know, it's not this will be a boon for Israel economically. It might be a boon for some of them, but their attitude is much more long-term, ideological. Even if it does cause a recession, it doesn't matter. This is a historic opportunity for Zionism. Whereas I think for the broader Israeli public, which is position on this is not entirely clear on annexation, I mean, a worsening of the economic situation could in fact steer them away from Netanyahu. So it's difficult to give you an absolutely firm answer because we don't know which way this is going to go yet. But those are some of the possibilities I see.
Thank you for those comments on economics and how it all interacts with each other, because economy is very globalized and what happens in one place impacts other places. And we also, as you said, we see it very well in the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We will move to Nicolay and his question.
You went into a lot of detail regarding the annexation that is likely to happen or in some way or another. So my question is how Netanyahu is going to utilize the COVID-19 pandemic to justify the policies or to perform some actions regarding the annexation.
He's already tried to do that. And certainly the idea of this unity government, I mean, that is the reason why the Benny Gantz and his colleagues said that they were going into the unity government. So it's already had a dramatic impact, and it's having an enormous impact economically. And again, I mean, I defer to those who are in Israel to talk more about the economic impact of COVID in Israel. I know that in my country, the economic impact has been profound. The government has essentially had to print money to keep the economy going and has essentially given people money to stay home and not go to work. And so the debt that has been built up and is being built up is dramatic. And if people are talking about Canada emerging from this with the same levels of relative debt as we did from World War II, which was an extraordinary circumstance if it goes on much longer. So, I mean, my understanding is that we're talking about a similar sort of set of possibilities in Israel as this goes forward. And so governments, when they're in this sort of situation, they feel empowered to take emergency powers unto themselves, to do the things that people want them to do to keep the economy going, to provide social safety, to provide social welfare. And the Israeli government, my understanding is, has done that and is doing that. Whether that translates into feeling empowered to go ahead and make the kind of changes that annexation implies is not clear to me. I mean, obviously for Mr. Netanyahu's political base, which matters to him most, they would be willing to go forward with annexation whether there was corona or not. They believe in it as an ideological religious imperative. But for the wider Israeli public, if they see a move towards taking advantage of this situation to pursue policies which make the economic situation of Israel worse and make their lives potentially worse, it could backfire. It could backfire quite dramatically. And again, this might be where the EU or others, have a role to play potentially, not even necessarily in doing some of the things we hear about, but just in talking about it, just in saying we will do this. That could have an impact. So as things stand right now, I think we're all kind of in a state of suspension. We're waiting to see actually what Netanyahu does with it. It's talked about. We hear plans, we hear ideas, we see lots of diplomatic movement and everything, but no one yet knows exactly what it means. And I think he's obviously calibrating and gauging very carefully what he thinks he can get away with and what others think they can do to stop him. So I think sort of until we know what kind of annexation he's talking about and what steps forward he sees for the peace process and how they are received, it's difficult to give a definitive answer. My sense is that economics is an area for Netanyahu which is very dangerous. And if things as a result of his policies are seen to have been dramatically worsened economically for the average Israeli, he will pay a price.
Thank you, Peter, for commenting on that, as well as COVID-19 may not go away anytime soon. So it's good already to think what are the short-term and long-term impacts of it on incentives in pursuing certain political plans. So we have one question on the chat, which is about conferencing technologies because of the coronavirus unleashed a whole new atmosphere of online events. First of all, do you think those technologies are equally available on both sides of the conflict? And secondly, do you think they will make it easier for people to get in touch or make it more difficult? And perhaps we also could get some comments on it from the Charney Center side about how do you think it will impact your works focused on bringing the two sides together?
You know, as I say, we're running these sort of track 2, track 1.5 dialogues in the Middle East, in Asia, have been for many years. We're trying to keep them going by this mechanism. To some extent, it allows for some exchanges of views, but generally our methodology is to bring people together every few months for in-person meetings. And we're finding that this mechanism doesn't give you the ability to really probe the depths of people's feelings and thoughts the way you can in person. Because of course, a lot of what goes on in these meetings goes on in the coffee breaks and the meals and the evenings. And that's when people really talk. And so this doesn't afford that, this mechanism. And also, you know, there are some concerns over security. I mean, there are different platforms which are more secure than others, but no electronic conversation is ultimately entirely secure. You always have some concerns that someone is listening or could be disruptive. So it's a means to keep a conversation going. I wouldn't say it's a means to have the kind of in-depth real examination of critical issues that is necessary in some of these fora. I think the other thing we have to bear in mind is that just as those of us on the side of the angels find this technology useful, I mean, those of us on the wrong side can find it useful too. You know, technology is a double-edged sword. I mean, I can see a lot of organizations which were unable to bring people together for a variety of reasons suddenly can, in a way. And so I think we have to watch that. I don't think we know the implications of that yet, but I think we have to watch out for that. We know that sort of with radicalization, which went on in the region over the last 10 to 15 years, the role of technology played a big role in that. So we'll see where all this new social networking leads in that respect. But I think the Charney Center was going to say something as well.
Yeah, we can hear from, I know who would be the best to answer the question.
I have some thoughts. I believe that it's kind of satirical how the fact that we've established a new lifestyle of social distancing has made us stronger in social networking. And in Israel, at least, I can say from a personal point of view that the social networking aspect and the media has helped develop a very strong sense of unity, nationwide unity. We were also struck with the lockdown during a very crucial time during the year, which is Passover and Independence Day, and the Nakba for the Palestinians, and it was all very comforting in a way to see how, despite our social distancing, we were also using the media as a platform to reconnect. But like Peter said, nothing really can compare to the peace simulations or the lectures or the workshops that we at the Charney Center do that involve personal contact and face-to-face conversations. As one who deals with a lot of EMIS alumni around the world, meeting you guys in person and having to hear your ideas and to even notice your body language, your excitement for projects that you have in mind, seeing that face to face helps stimulate a better process. And I've seen that at the Charney Center, and I see it around me living in Tel Aviv now. I see how personal relationships are truly key to making things run a little faster. And like Peter said, yeah, the personal connections help people resonate and relate to what the other person is saying. And I think it creates a more compassionate listening space. Yeah.
I would like to say that on a more practical note, conferencing technology might revolutionize the dialogue between both Israelis and Palestinians, considering Palestinians in the West Bank and the Palestinians in Gaza require permits and a whole background and security check before they actually enter Israel. So we can actually say or assume that this conferencing technology might make it easier to have this dialogue. But when put into practical terms, the Charney Center actually had a virtual peace simulation last week. But it was honestly very hard to follow, simply because there will always be that language barrier. And when you're in real life, when you're in front of someone and you have a translator who's translating everything simultaneously, it's very different than when you're doing everything virtually, because everything takes much longer when you're doing it via the internet. And I think the idea is such a revolutionary idea, but when put into practice, it might just make everything harder, or just not reach the exact depths that you would necessarily want it to reach.
Can I just come back with one sort of final thought on this, because it's an interesting question that opens up a lot of area for discussion. One thing that we're finding in our work, and I run a small NGO called the Ottawa Dialogue, which runs these track 1.5 dialogues in different parts of the world, is that where you have a group of people who already have built a relationship, they've had a chance to meet over the years to talk, and they have an ongoing dialogue. This kind of thing is good to keep it going. And I can see that, you know, when we get to the point where we're able to meet again, to have our discussions again, this kind of thing could be a very good supplement to our face-to-face meetings. Because the way we tend to work is we have, you know, for example, we're running dialogues between Indians and Pakistanis on Kashmir and other issues. And so we are able to meet, you know, 3 to 4 times a year. And we go to places like Dubai and Bangkok for 2 or 3 days. And that's fine. We have very good discussions and so on. And I can imagine that between those meetings, in the months between them, we could all hop on this for an hour and work on a problem that we've identified in a meeting, saying we want to do further work. And that could be very useful. But it will be a complement. It'll be sort of getting things ready for the next face-to-face meeting, or taking advantage of this medium to, in real time, have a discussion on a specific issue. But it won't replace the real meetings. It will be a complement to. I can see that as being very useful as a way forward.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your comments. And so now, maybe taking advantage of the international speakers here, also Clemens and Nicolay, maybe you would like to share some thoughts on how coronavirus perhaps impacted political systems, political processes that you are aware of in your countries, or other comments that you would like to share on the conversations that we are having.
I can make a few comments that I got from my immediate studies. Is that previously we had very bare bones kind of infrastructure at the university digitally, and that for some people that were also maybe impaired mobility wise, it was very hard to attend lectures and seminars to the full extent. And now that we have the whole online university situation, it enables many more people to join. And my hope is that after the whole situation kind of calm down, we can get back to presence, this digital infrastructure will remain, and it will enable all the people to have more access to it if you have no other option, or you're dependent on it to get this kind of information access whatsoever.
Well, I can also give a bit of comment. In general, the Russian government did a quite poor job in handling the COVID-19 situation. There were a lot of cases, and the numbers are still increasing. And I can say from the experience of the people who I know who live in Russia right now, and like my friends are students, and they said like the same as Clemens. Online platform for the studies has provided an enormous opportunity for the studying, and it has actually significantly broadened the ability and the amount of content the students were able to receive. Sadly, I cannot say much because I didn't know that much myself, but in terms of the universities and the studies, coronavirus actually has had, I would say, even a positive impact.
Thank you for your comments. And I can definitely relate, because I also have been studying online for the last 3 months, and it's enabling in certain aspects, better than not studying at all, but quite difficult also to stay in front of the screen for the whole day. But everyone can choose their preference, hopefully soon. So now I would like to ask Peter for some closing remarks. And if I may nudge you in certain direction, something that we haven't picked on yet is how being in person and protests are important elements of a democratic society. And from what we've seen is that coronavirus has hindered that aspect of democratic process in Israel. One more question that from Anna from Peru, about whether you think there could be another third party that could intervene in space of the vacuum created by less activity of the United States recently. So these are kind of, you can choose both of those topics or just give your general closing remarks.
In terms of sort of social protest, certainly just to the south of me, the whole Black Lives Matter protests, which went on massively, even in the time of Corona, have had a dramatic impact. And I think that it is all the more dramatic in the sense that people were taking a risk to go to these protests, and they knew it, a physical risk to themselves in terms of the spread of this virus. And so the fact that they were willing to do so is really, it was notable. And I think it caught a lot of people's attention, and it lent greater force to the point that these people were making. I wouldn't recommend it from a public health point of view, but it certainly was a dramatic statement of the way that people felt. I think that more generally, you know, if annexation goes forward, and if there are large-scale social protests in Israel and certainly in Palestine and perhaps in other Arab countries as well, this will also, it will not be good in terms of the coronavirus, but it will have a dramatic impact. And again, if we're talking about here some sort of a battle for public opinion in Israel and a battle for the broad mass of the Israeli populace who are not sort of ideological supporters of annexation, who could be talked into it if it appeared to be cost-free, but who will be against it if it appears to be costly, these things could be quite dramatic. So we'll see if that happens. In terms of Anna's question, I mean, it's something that we think a lot about in this field in terms of, you know, mediation and dialogue and so on. Who's the right person? I don't see any country being able to replace the US in terms of official mediation of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute for some time to come. I mean, I only hope that, speaking very personally, there'll be a different person in charge of the US after November, and that will enable the US to return to a role that it traditionally has held, which is not even-handed. I don't think we'd ever say that, but more even-handed and more able to try to sort of square differences and so forth. Right now, I don't see the current leadership of the US as being in a position to exercise that role morally. I don't think they even want to. I think they have demonstrated whom they are in favor of. I'm not sure that any other country can do that. Primarily because of even though, as I said a moment ago, in many ways, Europe is more important to Israel economically, no one is more important to Israel in terms of security. And we know that in Israel, security always trumps economics when it comes down to the crunch. But that doesn't mean to say that other voices can't be heard, and that in particular, if a new US administration wants to strike out on a new path in terms of its handling of this situation, that other countries won't be very helpful. And so, I mean, one is hopeful that, you know, after November, that might be possible. As things stand right now, I don't see any country replacing the US as the essential mediator of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. Unfortunately, I don't see the US wanting to play that role, which has been the key problem that we have right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you to Shana, Ophyr, Nicolay, and Clemens for being with us today. Thank you to Charney Center and Silly and Sari and Limay for always being there to support the mission. And yeah, we are here today virtually, but hopefully we will be able to meet one day, hopefully sooner than later, also in person. Many of you stayed with us until the end, so we hope that you got some takeaways from this very densely packed in content 1 hour. I personally learned a lot, and let's continue learning. Yeah, thank you everyone, and have a nice evening or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are.